Hello, Tina.
Hello, Vera.
Thank you for the time and the location. We are sitting here in London in your kitchen. Thanks a lot. As usual, I try to get some information about you. And I know you studied biology, genetics, development, and you founded companies, Collider Health, and others. And as usual, there are different stages in your careers. You wrote a book and you proceeded with your career. But tell yourself, who are you? What's important in your different stages of career?
So I have always been very, very interested in science and technology, and obviously that's one of the reasons why I studied genetics as I did. I did actually, when I was at university, I was pre-med, so I thought my intention was to go into becoming a doctor, which I decided not to do for all sorts of reasons. But I suppose I've always had an interest in really understanding what makes us human, right? And the science and technology behind that. And I suppose after many, many years of working in pharma and biotech, it sort of dawned on me that actually all the understanding of what really drives our health and who we are is actually really, really complicated. And I could see through many, many years of working in the healthcare industry that we didn't have all the answers, and that a lot of what we were doing was reinforcing what we know. And it kind of dawned on me that actually we have so much more power within ourselves to keep us healthy that we didn't know about. And of course, many of the industries and companies that have been founded on treating us when we're ill haven't really been addressing the central question about how to prevent us from getting ill in the first place. So that, I guess, and I could see there's a lot of reasons why things weren't changing. There's a lot of vested interest in the space about keeping the status quo. And so I guess I became quite interested in, and this is part of my natural curiosity, to start asking all the questions about, and I could see the impact of technology starting to reach, real people in their real worlds, and the power that would give them to actually make decisions that would actually have a major impact on their life. So I became quite interested in actually how do you arm people with the tools and the information to take more control over their own lives and destinies. So I guess that kind of made me start thinking and questioning, well, how could I look at this central question? And then one thing led to another. At a certain point in my life, I just felt that I could take the risks that I hadn't been able to take before, to kind of do my own thing and actually start to look at these sort of questions myself, working with organizations and people who were also asking the same sort of questions. So I guess that's how it all started. When at the age of 52, I decided to break away and do something quite different. And I guess ever since then, for the past 8 years, what I've really been looking at is how do we actually change the system, the status quo, that allows us to start changing this model of what I effectively call the sick care model, and make it much more prevention oriented, a new paradigm of health, and the system change, and what are the levers that you need to pull to drive that system change. So it's very, very complicated because, of course, a lot of the reasons why we have the situation that we find ourselves in now, it's because of control, power, influence, politics. It's all the things for things not changing, and to change that is actually quite challenging in itself. So you have to arm yourself with many, many people and organizations who are on this journey with you to even start to address all that. So that, I guess, is what I've been working out and trying to work out myself over the past 8 years, since I kind of have started doing my own thing, setting up, my own company, Collider Health, and of course many other ventures and companies since then, which all link back to the system change approach to moving this model of sick care to a much more preventative health paradigm.
Yeah, it doesn't help. We have all this research and all this knowledge, but we do not reach citizens.
Yeah.
And you have created sort of a platform to that everybody can access these data and research?
Yeah, I mean, it's more. I mean, that's part of it, but it's more around, I guess, involving them in coming up with, well, to challenge, but also to come up with the solutions. You know, involving citizens, so and real people in that. And of course, now with technology, and of course, I mean, we're seeing all of that happen more and more. I mean, we have, you know, tools and devices and apps, you know, that are within our control to use. But I think I'm also very interested in there's a limit to what we can control ourselves individually. There's a lot that we can't control, and that's where you have to then ask the questions of governments and of the way things are, our environments, the way that they're set up, where you may not have influence or you may not be able to control, like air pollution, for example. You know, there's only so much you can do. And that's a much bigger question. Of course, we're seeing that in a much bigger debate around climate change, for example, you know, all the reasons why we have the situation that we have today, where you've got fossil fuels burning, we've got air pollution, we've got all the things that are actually endangering our health, but yet we, in many ways, are powerless to choose, because it is such a monumental exercise to get everyone to work together to actually, you know, take that collective effort to solve some of these much bigger problems. And we have that with many other aspects of our health. We've got, you know, a food culture, a very obesogenic environments where we eat way too much junk food and ultra high processed food, and and junk food is cheap. So if you're from an environment where you've got a lot of unhealthy food shops and where you don't have much money, it's cheaper to buy junk food. You may not know how to cook. These all influence your decisions, and you may not have as much agency or control to influence that as you might like, as other people might have, where they can, you know, have more education or have more money or whatever it might be, where they can afford maybe some of the healthier food options, or have the educational ability to make the right choices, or know how to cook from scratch. You know, all these sorts of things start to make a big difference. And the same goes for housing. I mean, if you're unlucky enough to live in an area where you do have more air pollution, or you have a lot of, you know, congested roads, or less green spaces, you know, this takes away your power and your control. So of course these are the sorts of questions that governments have to look at. And it's really started to hit, I guess, the wider public debate in terms of, you know, in the UK, for example, we have a situation where we have very unhealthy people to the point where it is literally dragging the economy down in the UK. So these are the big questions that, of course, our current governments are looking at. Well, how do we create an environment where poor health is not dragging our economic prospects down? And that's a much bigger question. So this is where the system change and the long-term view is really, really important to address, which is a lot of the work that I'm getting involved with now.
So coming so far, you mentioned sometimes I was interested, my curiosity. What do you think, which traits of yours brought you so far? What would help to be mentioned?
Well, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I think what drives me personally is, I mean, I'm naturally a very curious person, and I ask questions. And I'm also incredibly, I guess, proactive as a person. Like, that's the entrepreneurial, I guess, quality that I have. I mean, and many people, they equate the word entrepreneur with just making a lot of money, for example, and setting up a business. And whereas for me, my entrepreneurialism is more around making things happen and getting things done, and starting from nothing and creating something. And obviously a lot of what I do is not about, I mean, I'm not motivated by money at all. In fact, I wish I was more motivated by money. I'd probably have less cash flow problems and all the rest of it that have entered, you know, parts of my life when I've set up businesses and so forth. It's more around, you know, I've been much more driven by impact on people, social impact. And I'm trying to, and I guess what I've been really trying to work out over the past few years is how social impact and making money can actually go together. And I think that's the whole new interesting space where I'm finding myself, is working within the investor community, working with, you know, pension funds and institutional investors, where they are very much motivated by money, but there's a whole new way of thinking about it, where the two can go hand in hand. And this whole new space of, whatever you want to call it, inclusive capitalism. I think coming out of COVID, I think there's been more and more recognition that to just grow the pie and to grow a bigger economy, ignoring the impact that it has on the wider population is not a recipe that seems to be working so well as it used to. So I think there's a whole, I guess, new recognition that capitalism for its own sake and making money for its own sake is not actually serving us well anymore, or as it used to. It has to be able to reach more people and be much more equitable. And I think that's the new, I guess, awareness that is starting to really start to drive new thinking and new ways of thinking about, well, everything really. So I was struck by, I was approached and by the New York Federal Reserve, where they recognized that, the impact on COVID on New York City, for example, was very, very serious. And they could see that the hardest hit groups were obviously the marginalized, the more vulnerable groups. And they've realized that this idea of just, making money for its own sake is not actually helping the wider pool. And actually this whole notion of investing in the wider determinants of our health, which is linked to our wealth and economic prosperity, is really becoming much more important. So I think that's interesting because that's starting to really look at, the wider pools of capital, the wider pools of investment monies, that is part of the levers of power and influence that you do need to look at in terms of real change. And so I think that's all really interesting. So I think we've kind of entered a new time in the world where I think some of these bigger questions are being asked by, the richer countries of the world, and at a time of very challenging geopolitics and inequity and all these sorts of things. So it shows that I think there is a wider consciousness happening, that is starting to reach many more people.
Yeah, it sounds everything very. You need lots of strength. Perseverance, also dealing with politics and governments and everything. Where do you recharge?
So I guess, going back to your original question about qualities, I think you have to have a brutal persistence. You have to be so persistent and not take the knockbacks personally, and you're just very focused on this, on a broader goal, right? And you don't, and being resilient to all the knockbacks, because especially when you're an unknown or you don't have any big name behind you or whatever, which of course was certainly the case with me. I started with a blank sheet of paper, and it was only through a lot of, I guess, working through networks and people I knew, and eventually people who do have the influence and the power and the money, and being very, very clear about what are the shared goals that we can all kind of get behind, and being very, very focused on that, and just being very, very persistent, very resilient, and just being very, very focused has obviously helped a lot. But I think being able to understand and this I guess is where having that ability to read people and understand people, you have to understand, how can you actually get someone into the same space as you, and understand where they're coming from, and knowing that you're going to have to find a space where you can agree and where there's something to work with. And so that replicated 1,000 times over is probably what I've done in terms of my collaboration and the partnerships that I've struck, and bringing people behind you. It's about understanding the win-win of many, many different types of people and trying to get them behind a much bigger goal is I guess, one of the, part of the formula, I guess, of how I've been able to achieve what I've set out to achieve with very little resources, very little money, actually. But just being, I guess, understanding people and how to get, and reading them, I guess, as in a way that allows you to conquer all the knockbacks.
It's empathy.
Empathy, yeah.
Empathy.
Yeah.
The always returning trait of empathy. One of the most important, I think.
Yeah. No, that's a good word to use. Yeah, empathy.
So you can try to read others, try to understand, and you get more tolerant also.
Yeah. And I think being able to doing as much as you can, even though you may not agree with someone's perspective, it's trying to be in their shoes and trying to understand why is it that they've got a certain view. And normally, you know, there are very, very good reasons for it. You know, we are all creatures of structures and of incentives. You know, we're all led by incentives and what are we motivated by? So having understanding that is a very important part of progress, actually, because you have to understand why people do things and how you can actually maybe influence and change their perspectives, you know, through understanding where they're coming from.
And often they cannot help themselves.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so sad, but it's the reason often for disagreement and hassle.
Yeah.
Still, where do you recharge?
So recharge. So that's where, well, it comes from a number of different places. It's finding, being very, very, I guess, happy with who you are as a person and doing the things that you love and enjoy, and being surrounded by people who you love and trust. So I've been very lucky. I've got a very strong partnership with my husband, and I've got wonderful children and wonderful friends and family. And of course, that's a huge source of support that you get. A lot of the stuff that I do in many ways is quite solitary because, you know, you're having to be so evangelical and sort of persuasive all the time to try and influence people. And it can be quite solitary, actually, and quite frustrating sometimes.
Of course.
And this is where you do need the support in the back, you know, people who you admire and trust yourself and rely on. So that, of course, is very, very important. I mean, for me, it's also just about basic stuff like exercise and being able to find time and peace. You know, I spend time, and sometimes, you know, I love people and I love being surrounded by people, but I sometimes just need that space of just being on my own. And that's also part of the recharge, you know. And of course, I love the outdoors. I love dancing. I love all these other pursuits which allow me to kind of take a step back and obviously recharge as well. But I work very hard, and I get a lot of energy and motivation from what I love doing, which is also my professional work.
Keeps you going.
It keeps me absolutely motivated and going, and you know,
That's also your latest career, the Tina Technic.
Tina Technotic, yes. Which is a new thing.
It's a new thing. You started a DJ career.
Which I wasn't expecting at all. So that's one of life's little fun serendipity sort of moments where it kind of happens.
Yeah. It started that you like dancing and raving, and then you couldn't beginning of the year.
Yes.
So your career started there, that you started DJing yourself.
Yes.
So interesting.
So that was a slight surprise, I guess, because I've always been a very energetic, physically active sort of person, and I, you know, in my youth, in my 20s, I mean, I used to go dancing and go to parties and all the rest of it. But it was only when a few years ago, actually, it was coming out of COVID, actually, when I discovered, and it was just through a strange series of events where I went dancing with some girlfriends, and we ended up going, and this is right post-lockdown, when I think everyone was just feeling so happy being allowed to go out again.
Yeah.
And I just went out to go dancing with my girlfriends, and I suddenly realized it just rekindled something in me that I felt I couldn't ignore. And then I started doing more dancing, and then I started going to my Zumba classes again, which I used to do, but then my schedule had changed when I started doing all this work with Collider Health, and I was more home-based, and it just sort of went from there. And I just realized that there are a lot of things around emotionally, psychologically, physically, even in a funny sort of way, spiritually, it all sort of came rushing to me, this need to dance. And I started doing more and more. And then, of course, I realized I had to go through the surgery for my feet, which I kept on putting off. And I finally bit the bullet, and I found a surgeon who I felt I could trust, and because that was really important, that I didn't sort of go through the surgery and then feel that I wouldn't be able to walk again, which obviously filled me with horror and dread, this idea of losing my mobility, because I see that as so important to my happiness, as being mobile. And went through the surgery, but I realized that actually the biggest part of planning for surgery like that is how am I going to cope with the recuperation and the post-surgical recovery. And I knew that it would be like 4 to 6 months where I wouldn't be able to be as physically active, as I normally am, and be able to dance and all the rest of it. So I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, and just through a series of strange coincidences, I remember reading a LinkedIn post of a colleague of mine who had made some point about how she had started a rock band, and she's in her 50s, and I kind of made some comment on the LinkedIn post, I quite fancy DJing by the time I hit 60, which isn't far off. And then I was speaking to one of my dancing companions about this idea, well, maybe I should learn how to mix music as a way to distract myself when I'm not able to dance. And then she said, I'd quite like to become a DJ as well. So we thought, well, why don't we learn together? And then one thing led to another. And before I knew it, my sons had given me a very simple DJ controller as a Christmas present, a week after I had my first foot operated on. And then I just started to have a go. And then one thing led to another. And then I hit 60, and then I thought, maybe, I started learning how to mix music. And I thought, well, why don't I have a go? Because DJing is something you can do forever, even if you can't keep on dancing. And of course, there are a lot of DJs who are in their 60s and 70s who are still going strong. So then put on Longevity Rave. And then that was my first go having it. DJing was literally at my own event with my companion, Yukari, my co-DJ. And then I got a whole bunch of people involved, and then it all sort of took off from there. And now I'm finding that I'm doing these events all around the world now, which is kind of crazy. I would never have expected it. But this is the sort of thing that can happen in life, and you follow your nose, and then suddenly you realize you're doing it. And of course, what's interesting about, and I think one of the reasons why it has taken off in the way that it has, is it kind of ties in this whole notion of following your passions, following your joy. And for me, it was all about making this point that, for me, it's kept me being very physically active. It's allowed me to continue with my passions. And that is a whole new area which I think has been under recognized in this whole field of longevity, which of course I've been very involved with over the past few years, which has tended to focus very much on the very, very hardcore sort of scientific sort of the biology of aging end, where you're really trying to understand the internal mechanisms, from your genetics, your epigenetics, your physiology. But I realized, and through all the work that I've been doing over the past few years, that actually what you do in your life and all the external influences in your life, the environments in which you live, they have a huge impact on your biology, on your genetics, on your epigenetics. And for me, that is an unexplored space that I think needs much more exploration, much more research, much more data. And in a funny sort of way, the idea of these longevity raves, it's bringing the whole message of that to a much wider audience. It's tapping into young people who also need to be part of this journey of living healthier for longer, because it's fine to start late and, if you hit 50, to start getting into better habits. But actually, what's much better is if you start healthier habits from even before you're born, from your parents' perspective, and start as early as possible. And so there's a whole, message that needs to hit the wider population, that it's really important to enjoy your life, do what you love, follow your motivations, and try and get involved in habits where you don't even have to think of them as hard to do. It's like, you just build them into your daily life. So that's a broader message around the idea of dancing. Of course, music and dancing, and of course DJing does bring people of all sorts of groups together. And so I think that's another reason why it has been successful and is hitting a nerve, because you're sending this broader message about health to a lot of different types of people who may not even be thinking about health. So anyway, there's this bigger point to it. It's not just dancing and DJing.
No,
there's a much bigger point.
It's also your colleague DJ. You said
You carry.
she's really young.
Yeah, she's 27, so much younger than me. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also this aspect, it's possible to work together. It's possible that two women, different ages, bring forward something. And that's, for me, also a very strong point.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a beautiful thing about the friendship is that, and this is a thing which I think is also a really important message, is that, age shouldn't define you. I think in the end, it's about the energy and who you are that defines you. And I think, and I see that across everything. I mean, it's not just age; it's everything. It's your gender, it's your sexual preferences, it's where your race. It's all these sorts of things. I have a problem with too many labels given to people, and I just think, why can't we just focus on who we are as individuals, as people?
Yeah.
And what fundamentally we're all. And this is what I find at getting older is that. There's the inner goodness and the sort of and the things that bind all of us as human beings that is what we should really focus on. The sort of what is it that connects us all, and it is the very, very basic principles of humanity, really. And I think we all actually in the end want very, very similar things. We want love, we want connection, we want a feeling of belonging. Yes, we need the basic hygiene factors, enough to eat and having decent housing, all those sorts of things. But actually, fundamentally, what really drives the human being are quite universal factors, actually.
Yeah.
And so I think focus on that, and I think these are the sorts of principles that I think need to guide. I think a lot of, I guess, this bigger stuff around system change, going back to the earlier points around governments and investors and all the rest of it. There's some very basic stuff that, we have to really remember, about what makes us happy and what allows human beings to flourish wherever they are in the world. And we often forget that. We get very focused on the money, the aspirations, and in the end, that doesn't actually necessarily drive human happiness, actually. And so, so I'm constantly reminded about that when I spend time with people who are outside of my own social circles, which you often get when you do go out dancing, for example, and also when you're traveling. I mean, that's the beauty about traveling to all sorts of different places around the world, and different religious groups and, different cultures. You're kind of struck by the universal truths of what actually does bind most people together. So we focus so much on what drives us apart, and that's the challenges of the world at the moment. And there's some bigger points about, well, how can we focus on bringing people together, and what does that look like? So these are big philosophical questions that I guess, as you get a bit older, you start, asking more and more. And I think what I'm often struck by when I do speak to a lot of younger people, it's like I'm constantly reminded that we're all on this journey. And I'm reminded that I was on that same journey when I was in my 20s, being less confident than I am and maybe less unsure about who I am. But this is part of what you do and the journey that you're on as a young person, and trying to get to a point where you feel happy with yourself and what you are as an individual, and what you're looking for in your life. It is a journey for all of us. And hopefully that's one of the good things that you get when you're a bit wiser and older. You can kind of feel more at peace with that. And,
And you realize what really counts and what makes you happy. Also, pandemic had this effect when you could not meet and you had to struggle and fight for your relationships. That was really tough.
Well, when your freedoms are taken away from you, I mean, all the freedoms that we take for granted, certainly in the Western world, were taken away. I mean, the ability to, leave your house and, do all these sorts of things. I mean, these are, freedoms that we take for granted. So I think having them back just allows you to think, gosh, I shouldn't take those for granted. And the ability to see your family and friends. I mean, these were freedoms that were taken away from us, which are very, very important.
It's also a point in all these research and longevity discussions. They talk about sleep, eat, motion, but there is the strong mental aspect, how psychologically, how you deal with your relationships. I think this is a field that needs more work on.
Yeah. So so I think So psychological stress and behavior and things like that are so important to understand, and we're seeing almost like a ticking time bomb in the Western world, especially with our younger populations in terms of the mental health crisis. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. It's something that it's a big area that is very relevant with some of my work at the moment. Is how do we deal with the stresses in our lives, which are really affecting young people and of course older people as well. Work stress and financial worries, climate change issues, threat of war, cost of living crisis. There's a lot of different stresses in our modern, day-to-day lives, certainly in the Western context and certainly in the UK where I live. And, these are having a huge bearing on our health and on our biology. I mean, that's the other thing too, and the science and technology just really shedding light on that. And what you don't get from animal studies, for example, which is where a lot of the latest research, certainly in the context of longevity science, is taking place. And I think, again, this is a new frontier, which I'm very, very involved in, is actually really understanding how all this research that is being done in labs and animal studies, how that will translate into the real world of human beings. Yeah. So that's the next big frontier, which I'm very, very interested in. And a lot of my work is trying to understand, because I think, and this is where there's only so much you can do as an individual to take agency and control your life. No matter how many pills you take, no matter how rich you are, it's the collective responsibility of us in communities and cities and nation states that will then have a bearing on everyone's lives. And so there is this collective responsibility, and you can only get that through mechanisms available through governments and a much bigger way of seeing the system. And so I think the individualism that I think we get preoccupied, the individual control that we have over our lives, where there's a huge preoccupation in the Western world, I think it only goes so far. And that is where I think we have a lot to learn from Eastern medicine, Eastern philosophy, where it is much more sort of collective, where we do think much more about the interaction and our effect on others. It's not just about us. It's not just about your own preferences and your own desires. You have to think collectively. And I think that's, again, the next new frontier that we really have to enter in with policy and all those sorts of things, that collective responsibility of us and the broader world. And you see that so clearly with the climate change threat. Yeah. We all have to take responsibility. All nations have to work together. And I see, the link with health also in a similar way too, because we're seeing for the first time, we saw at COP28, health is on the agenda, and actually the root causes of ill health are very, very, and of course the solutions are very intimately linked with the threat of climate change, for example. So these are, good reminders that, and I saw that when I went recently to Pakistan. They're very worried about climate change, and they can see the impact of Western culture and, construction on, the highways there, and the pollution that's being brought in, the threat to glaciers. I mean, it's all happening all over the world. So I do think it's an interesting moment in time, for governments to come together and for nations to come together to actually really look at this collectively. And I think, the threats are so real now that I think, and I think the post-COVID experience with people and the general public have reached a point where there's a greater appetite to look at this in a different way.
The damage is visible. Mm-hmm. For us in Switzerland, we just can look at the glaciers melting. Mm-hmm. And it's a friend of mine said, I go and visit the glaciers because I'm not so sure that my children will see them. It's obvious, it's there.
Yeah, it is obvious, and you can see that everywhere, where there are mountains. And I mean, it is just so obvious that you can't hide it anymore.
Yeah. Dealing with young people, and you have sons, is there sort of advice you give or discussions you open?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly with my own children, and I could see it also with their friends, there's a lot of, I think some of it is driven by just greater awareness and social media and all these sorts of things, all the ills and the dangers and all the bad things that are happening in the world at the moment. And I think that can be very depressing, obviously to a young person. And I think, and so, and I have some challenging conversations sometimes with my sons, and I say to them, well, listen, it hasn't been easy in other generations either, actually. And if you look at some of the bald facts, the fact is our standard of living has increased. There is a lot, I think certainly what we're seeing now is there's almost like social mobility has increased. And what that means is that, yes, for those who had it good in the past may find it more challenging now as there's been more equality and so forth. But I think there's a lot to be optimistic about as well. And I think, you don't want to become, it shouldn't be a self-fulfilling prophecy that, things are just going to always be bad. We all have to, work together to make the world a better place. And that does take personal responsibility, initiative, and not being a victim. That's the other, and I think probably a lot of what I've been trying to do in my own life is not to be a victim and to actually be part of the solution. And I share that with my own family and my own sons all the time. You have it in your own gift, your own power to actually make a difference. And I think all of us have the responsibility to do that with the resources and the gifts that you have as an individual, but also collectively with your networks and all the rest of it. But I think, we can all be victims, but that doesn't get us anywhere.
No. Better be proactive.
Absolutely. And try as much as possible to be a master of your own destiny.
Yeah, you can, if you want the responsibility.
Yeah. Then you have to take responsibility.
Do you have an utopia?
A utopia?
What should the world be like? The perfect one? Possible or not?
Yeah, listen, I think, there's, you can't get away from human nature. We are tribal creatures, and there is that survival instinct that ultimately you will fight to survive when it really comes down to it, and that you will never be able to change, because in that sense we have all come from bacteria, amoeba. We've all come from the same thing, and there's this sort of inherent instinct that will always be there. I think we are tribal creatures. We will protect our own. We will always, there's that whole kind of need to belong in groups. That will never change. So I think there's a limit to what we can all cope with in terms of being completely magnanimous and unselfish and all the rest of it. And that's just human nature, and we have to understand that. I think, but I do think when resources are limited and are increasingly limited in the world, I think there comes a point, and I think this is the interesting point, that just grabbing for yourself is, again, that will be part of your demise. So I do think there is a growing awareness that one has to be generous and look not just to yourself and your own immediate clan, that they're, for your own protection, but also it goes hand in hand, for this preservation of the wider good. So I do think, so in terms of utopia, I think what would be great, and I talk about this, is, I think being fair and just and doing what you would want to do, doing as you would want others to do for yourself, be a good neighbor, all those sorts of things. I think these are principles that I think we should all be guided by. Harder said than done, of course. But I think the utopia for me is, for myself, is to feel that I can leave this world hopefully in a better place than I found it, which, is not an easy one. And to feel that I've always tried to behave in a way, tries to be a good neighbor, a good person to people, that I hope I won't have, I hope, not to have regrets. We all make mistakes. And of course, that's just part of life. But I think if we can come to a place where, the utopian world where there's the ability to share resources equitably and fairly, I think would be great. We haven't hit that point yet, and may never, but hopefully we can at least even up access to resources, you know, around the world, which isn't going to be easy, because the people who've got it good are going to have to let go of some of that to be able to let those who don't have it so good to have what we also value and what we treasure. So that's not going to be easy, but if we can have some sort of means of achieving that, then that I think would be a good solution, particularly in a world where we are stretched with resources and so forth at all levels. I mean, yeah, you know, human resources, you know, the planet's resources, it's everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. That was really inspiring. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I kind of got a little bit vague, but...
No, that's all good. Thank you so much, Tina, for your time.
Oh, that's fine. Well, thank you.